We often look to the past to understand ourselves. Tonight, we turn our attention to the year 1888 and the solemn story of Mary Ann Nichols. It's a case that reminds us that behind historical records are real people whose lives were irrevocably changed by the events that transpired. This is their story, as best as it can be told. In the late summer of 1888, the East End of London was a world away from the grandeur of the Victorian capital. Whitechapel was a district of stark contrasts, a labyrinth of gaslit alleys, overcrowded lodging houses, and desperate poverty. It was a place where thousands struggled for survival, living day to day on meager earnings from precarious work. The air was thick with the smoke of coal fires and the noise of a restless, teeming population. Life for many, particularly for women without the protection of family or fortune, was a relentless and often brutal challenge. It was against this grim, oppressive backdrop that a series of events would unfold, events that would terrorize a city and create a legend of darkness that endures to this day. This story begins not with the legend, but with one of the women at its heart, a 43-year-old whose life reflected the hardships of her time. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, though she was more commonly known as Polly.
Mary Ann Nichols was born Mary Ann Walker in London in 1845. She was the daughter of a locksmith and by all accounts had an ordinary start in life. In 1864, she married William Nichols, a printer's machinist, and together they had 5 children. For a time, their life followed a conventional path. However, by the early 1880s, the marriage had fallen apart. The reasons are debated by historians. Accounts suggest William may have left her for another woman, while he claimed her heavy drinking made their life together impossible. Whatever the cause, the separation set Mary Ann on a difficult and downward path. Without the stability of her marriage, she cycled through the harsh institutions of Victorian society designed for the destitute. She spent time in the Lambeth workhouse, a place of last resort for the impoverished, and briefly lived with her father. She held various jobs as a domestic servant, but her struggles with alcohol often made it difficult to maintain steady employment. For several years, she was a transient figure, moving between workhouses, lodging houses, and periods of rough sleeping. By the spring of 1888, after a brief period of stability in service, she had drifted to the common lodging houses of Whitechapel, joining the ranks of the area's most vulnerable residents.
Thursday, August 30th, 1888 was the last full day of Mary Ann Nichols's life. Like any other, it was dictated by the need to earn enough money for a bed for the night. The cost was 4pence, a small sum that was often a fortune to those with nothing. That evening, around 11 p.m., she was seen walking down Whitechapel Road. A little over an hour later, at 12:30 a.m. on the morning of August 31st, she was seen leaving a pub in Brick Lane. The pub was a focal point of the community, a fleeting escape from the harshness of the streets. Shortly after, she returned to her lodging house at 18 Thrall Street. Here, she met the deputy who asked for her doss money. Mary Ann did not have it. She reportedly told him not to worry, that she would soon have the money, gesturing to a new black bonnet she was wearing. Her final known words before she departed were, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." At approximately 2:30 a.m., she was seen for the last time by a friend, Emily Holland, at the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. According to Holland, Marianne was heavily intoxicated and unsteady on her feet, but she refused the offer to return to the lodging house with her. Instead, she turned and walked off alone into the darkness, heading east along the desolate street.
Less than an hour after her final sighting, Marianne Nichols's journey came to a horrific end in a dark, narrow street called Bucks Row. It was a quiet, unremarkable street, lined with small cottages on one side and a large board school and stables on the other. At approximately 3:40 a.m., a cart driver named Charles Cross was walking to his job at a nearby depot. The street was dimly lit by a single gas lamp, and as he made his way through the gloom, he noticed a dark shape lying on the ground in a gateway opposite a stable yard. As he drew closer, he saw it was the body of a woman. Her skirts were raised, and he initially assumed she was drunk and had perhaps been assaulted. Moments later, another cart driver, Robert Paul, approached on his way to the same workplace. Cross called out to him, and together they approached the body. They gently pulled her dress down to cover her. Believing she might still be alive, but hesitant to get involved and be late for work, they decided to continue on their way and alert the first police officer they encountered. Just a few hundred yards down the road, they found a constable and reported their discovery. They told him what they had seen, and then carried on to their work, leaving the grim scene in the hands of the law. The first police officer to arrive at Bucks Row was Police Constable John Neal of the Metropolitan Police's J Division 8. Acting on the information from the two cart drivers, he proceeded to the gateway and found the woman lying on her back, her head pointing towards the street. Using his lantern, he made a quick examination. He saw no immediate, obvious signs of violence, but he could feel that her hands and face were cold. He believed she was dead. He was soon joined by another officer, Constable John Thane, who brought with him Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn, a local surgeon whose practice was nearby. As the officers secured the scene, Dr. Llewellyn conducted a more thorough examination. He confirmed that the woman was deceased and had likely been dead for only a short time, perhaps half an hour. He noted a deep cut across her throat and some bruising on her face. At this preliminary stage, the full, horrific extent of her injuries was not yet apparent. The initial police response was methodical. They searched the immediate area for any clues, a weapon, or signs of a struggle. They found nothing. The cobblestones were dry, and there were no bloodstains on the ground around the body, suggesting the attack had been swift and that she had been laid on the ground almost immediately. An ambulance was called, and the body of the unknown woman was transported to the Whitechapel mortuary. It was at the mortuary, under the stark light of a gas lamp, that the true horror of the crime was revealed. As the woman's clothing was removed by the workhouse officials in preparation for the formal post-mortem, they discovered devastating injuries to her abdomen. The police were immediately recalled, and Dr. Llewellyn was summoned back to the mortuary. What he found was shocking, even for a surgeon accustomed to the grim realities of the East End. The woman's throat had been severed by two deep, clean cuts that went down to the spine, but far worse was the mutilation of her torso. Her abdomen had been cut open with a series of jagged, deep incisions. The wounds were inflicted with a degree of ferocity and anatomical violence that was unlike anything the experienced doctor or the police had ever encountered. The instrument used was believed to be a long, sharp knife wielded with considerable force. The brutality was profound and deeply unsettling. This was not a simple robbery gone wrong or a typical act of street violence. The nature of the wounds suggested a motive that was entirely different, something driven by a cold, sadistic rage that defied easy explanation and marked the beginning of a new and terrifying chapter of crime in London.
The official investigation began with the coroner's inquest, a legal proceeding designed to determine the cause of death. It was presided over by the coroner for East Middlesex, Wynne Edwin Baxter. The first order of business was to identify the victim. She was soon recognized by a former resident of the Lambeth workhouse as Marianne Polly Nichols. Her estranged husband, William Nichols, was brought in and formally confirmed her identity. He was deeply distressed, stating he had not seen her for 3 years, but had heard she was living a difficult life. The inquest then turned to establishing her final movements. Witnesses like Emily Holland provided a timeline for her last hours, painting a picture of a woman desperate to earn the few pence needed for a bed. The cart drivers, Charles Cross and Robert Pole, recounted their discovery of the body in the dark gateway. Police Constable Neal described the scene as he first found it. Their testimonies established the time and place of death with a degree of certainty, but offered no clues as to the identity of her killer. Dr. Llewellyn's testimony was the most chilling. He described the victim's terrible injuries in stark clinical detail, concluding that they were inflicted by a left-handed individual with some degree of anatomical knowledge. The police investigation, led by Frederick Aberline of Scotland Yard, was immediately faced with immense challenges. The crime had occurred in a dark street, with no apparent witnesses. The killer had moved with silence and speed, leaving behind no weapon, no footprints, and no tangible clues. The officers of H Division conducted extensive house-to-house inquiries in and around Bucks Row, interviewing hundreds of residents. They questioned sailors from the nearby London docks and workers from the local slaughterhouses, places where men would be accustomed to using sharp knives. Despite their exhaustive efforts, no viable suspects emerged. The press, however, was not so patient. London's newspapers, particularly the new sensationalist penny dreadfuls, seized upon the story. They filled their columns with lurid details, speculative theories, and graphic illustrations. The murder in Bucks Row was a sensation, tapping into the public's fascination with crime and the dark underbelly of their city. This intense media scrutiny created a climate of fear and panic, placing enormous pressure on a police force that was struggling with a crime that had no precedent. The killer was a phantom, and with each passing day and each new headline, the mystery and the terror grew.
As the inquest continued, the evidence pointed towards a chilling conclusion. This was not an isolated act of violence. The brutality and specific nature of the mutilations led both the police and the public to connect the murder of Marianne Nichols to earlier, unsolved attacks on women in the area. A narrative began to form of a lone, predatory figure stalking the streets of Whitechapel. On September 8th, just over a week after Nichols's death, another woman, Annie Chapman, was found murdered in a nearby street with even more horrific injuries, confirming the city's worst fears. A serial killer was at large. The press gave this shadowy figure a name that would become infamous: Leather Apron, a local character who was briefly a suspect, but later cleared. The name that would truly stick, however, had not yet emerged. The coroner's jury, having heard all the evidence in the Nichols case, delivered their verdict. They formally concluded that Mary Ann Nichols was murdered by some person or persons unknown. It was a simple, factual statement, but it did little to quell the growing hysteria. The verdict officially marked the beginning of what would become known as the Autumn of Terror. The death of Polly Nichols was no longer just a tragic local crime. It was now the first confirmed act of a killer who was about to become a legend.
The murder of Mary Ann Nichols was the beginning, the crime that set the terrifying pattern for the murders that followed. She is remembered today as the first of the canonical 5 victims of the killer who would soon be known to the world as Jack the Ripper. Her death, and the deaths of the women who followed her, exposed the brutal reality of life for the poor in Victorian London in a way that no social report ever could. The intense media spotlight forced the public and the authorities to confront the appalling conditions of the East End. While the killer was never caught, the legacy of the crimes included renewed calls for social reform, slum clearance, and changes in policing. For Mary Ann Nichols, her story is often overshadowed by the monstrous legend of her killer. But it is important to remember her not as merely the first victim, but as a woman, a daughter, a wife, and a mother, whose life was shaped by poverty and misfortune, and whose tragic end marked the start of one of history's most enduring and chilling criminal mysteries.